In A Song of Ice and Fire, one of the most pivotal parts of the Lannister family is the Lady Johanna, cousin and wife to the infamous Tywin, mother of his children, Cersei, Jaime, and Tyrion. Even though she's dead by the time the main series starts, she has a very huge effect on the Lannister family and their connections with each other. Before her death, people would often joke that while Tywin may have ruled the realm, because he was hand of the king and a more effective ruler than Aerys Targaryen, secretly, Tywin was ruled at home by his wife. It's said that Johanna is the only person who truly knew Tywin beneath all of his armor and his facade, and that she was the only one who could make him smile. She was basically the light of Tywin's life, and she was loved by their children, Cersei in particular, as her death is something that Cersei holds against her younger brother Tyrion. She blames him for her mother's death, and so does their father Tywin, even though Tyrion never asked to be born, or to be a dwarf for that matter. It even gets to a point where Tywin refuses to acknowledge Tyrion, and even insinuates that he may not be his. There is a theory out there that Tyrion may be the son of Mad King Aerys instead of Tywin Lannister. I've actually talked about that theory on the channel, so feel free to check that out when you get the chance. Either way, the death of Johanna plays a very key part in the Lannister family dynamics, and Tyrion's life. But what if Lady Johanna had never died? How could the story change if the Lannisters actually had a mother to guide them? Let's find out. Our story opens on Casterly Rock, where things don't go that differently from the original timeline. Lady Johanna Lannister is busy giving birth to her third child by Tywin Lannister. It's a long and difficult process, much worse than when she delivered her twins, Cersei and Jaime. For a brief moment, it even makes people fear that bringing the child into the world may even kill Lady Johanna. But despite the strain on her body, she manages to safely deliver her son into the world. However, the birth was so difficult that she will remain bedridden for a while. As we move forward, it's important to mention that while Johanna was noted to be one of the kinder Lannisters, we have no way of knowing how she would have reacted to Tyrion. For all we know, she could have just rejected him on the account of his dwarfism, horrified that she could produce such a child like this. Crazy as it may sound, parents reject and abandon their children all the time for varying selfish reasons, even in the real world. Just because Johanna is kind doesn't mean that she's going to be accepting. But for the sake of this video, we'll say that Johanna is. She really is just a kind woman, and if she can love someone like Tywin Lannister, who's wiped out entire families for slights against his own, then she can love innocent little Tyrion. So that kindness, that warmth that Johanna seemed to bring to everyone else in the family is extended to him unconditionally, regardless of his circumstances. So while everyone stands shocked at the newborn, Johanna simply asks to hold her son. She doesn't see him as some monster like other people. She doesn't see him as deformed. She just sees a baby, her baby, and she loves him dearly. This sets the stage for a pretty big change within the Lannister family, as with the survival of Johanna, the dynamics change. Tywin hates Tyrion in canon, because he was born a dwarf, but more so because he blamed him for the death of his wife. It's said that the best parts of Tywin died with Johanna when she gave birth to Tyrion. This is also the same case with Cersei, where she hated her brother for robbing her of a mother, and she uses his dwarfism as proof of his monstrousness. But with Johanna alive, she may be able to change that. The sting of her death is no longer present for the Lannister family, and Tyrion can't be blamed for killing her in this timeline. While I do believe that Tywin and Cersei would still be put off by Tyrion's condition, the survival of Johanna would mediate things between Tyrion and the rest of his family somewhat. Tywin would have no choice but to treat Tyrion better, since he can't blame him for the death of his wife anymore. I don't think he'd be so openly abusive, spiteful, and hateful with his wife alive, and no one to blame his troubles on. And he doesn't want to make Johanna upset by ostracizing and abusing their son. He's a happier man with his wife alive, and this will lead to more tolerance for his second son, even if deep down he feels that Tyrion is unbecoming of the name Lannister. The same would go for Cersei. A lot of her hate stems from the belief that Tyrion killed her mom, that he's a monster, but with her alive, Johanna can help foster a better relationship between the two of them, and that hate that came from Cersei because of Johanna's death wouldn't be present. But even so, with that being said, I don't believe it would entirely solve the problem. Johanna would do everything she could to make Tyrion feel loved, and perhaps to get Cersei to love him the same way. And while she wouldn't hate Tyrion to the same degree as canon, I do think that Cersei, who has been a bit of a narcissist since childhood, would still find ways to pick on Tyrion and mock him when Mother isn't around as they get older. Cersei's dislike of Tyrion would also get worse when she gets a prophecy from Maggie the Frog, that one day she'll be queen, and her children will all die. Then the Valancourt, which means younger brother, will end up killing her. Now, Cersei is the oldest of Tywin's children, having come into the world before Jaime, but despite having 2 younger brothers, she only considers Tyrion to be a threat to her as the Valancourt, and it would be the same here. So despite Johanna living, Cersei and Tyrion would still have trouble getting along. But aside from that, there would be some significant changes to the Lannister family, primarily for Tyrion, as he no longer has to grow up in a home where most of the people hate him there. He gets to know what it's like to have a mother's love, the unconditional kind that comes from just existing and being himself as a member of the family, the same kind of love he got from his brother Jaime growing up. And while Cersei is mean to him in private, he has a father who tolerates him now. Tywin wouldn't be going out of his way to talk down to Tyrion, to torture him, and I think that this would come up in a surprising way later on in the story. But we'll get to that. For now, though, an interesting event that comes from Johanna's survival is that she'll be alive and present when the Martells come to Casterly Rock. In canon, she was friends with the mother of Elia and Oberyn, who came to Casterly Rock after Johanna's death to make a marriage pact with the Lannisters, offering Elia for Jaime or Oberyn for Cersei. Tywin refused the match in canon, but with Johanna still alive, I think that she would try to convince Tywin to do otherwise, given that her friend is making a request, and a part of her would also want to separate Cersei and Jaime at this point. During their childhood, Johanna actually caught the 2 of her children in the act, or at least a servant did, and they informed Johanna about what happened. After which, Johanna threatened to tell Tywin about the children if they did it again. Then she took measures to keep them separated and make sure they weren't alone together. To her, Cersei marrying Oberyn would probably be ideal, as it would nip any future problems in the bud, as she would most likely go back to Dorne with the Martells. And I actually made a video discussing that outcome here on the channel, if you feel so compelled to check it out later on, if you haven't already. But once again, Tywin, despite his wife's input, will still refuse. While the Martells are a powerful and notable family, Tywin gains nothing by marrying Cersei to a second son like Oberyn, who has nothing to inherit. His heart would still be set on a match between Cersei and Prince Rhaegar. And in regards to Jaime and Elia, he really just doesn't think the Princess of Dorne is good enough for his son. So that's dead too. In light of this, I could see Johanna being tempted to tell Tywin about the incest as a way to force his hand. But I do believe that for the time being, she will hold back on telling the truth, tempted as she may be. One, because a part of her believes things haven't gotten to the point between the kids where it's absolutely necessary for them to be exposed. As far as she knows, it was a one-time thing, and she didn't even see what happened herself. So in truth, she doesn't really know how bad it was, and she could just label it as a misadventure caused by youthful ignorance. 2, a part of her feels that even if she does tell Tywin, it will mean nothing. He'll still be set on that Rhaegar match, or maybe he'll refuse to believe her altogether and dismiss it. So she remains silent, probably silently hoping that that Rhaegar match does come through so she doesn't have to worry about her children anymore. For the most part, nothing really deviates heavily from the main story when it comes to the Lannisters, even with the survival of Johanna. Tywin still serves as hand of the king to King Aerys and takes Cersei to court with him. Jaime squires at Craighall to become a knight, and Tyrion is left at home with his uncles and mom. With Johanna alive and loving, Tyrion would definitely have a much better childhood, since his mother would be another reassuring presence in his life outside of his uncles and his brother Jaime. This leads to Tyrion being a much better person than he is in canon. And when I say canon, I'm kind of referring to the books in this instance. In the show, Tyrion is overall a pretty decent guy, but in the books, while Tyrion is sympathetic, he does make a series of questionable and even evil decisions that the show chose to cut out of his character. And a lot of that stems from how he was raised and treated by the world, looked down on and tormented by his own family, and ridiculed by society. Some of these things, of course, still take place in his life, but with his mother around and Tywin not going out of his way to ruin his life, I believe that Tyrion goes through developments that make him a kinder person than he's presented in the books, and even the show, because he still has his issues there as well. He won't be as paranoid or as eager for approval because he already has it much earlier on in his life, even if it is in a more limited capacity. Outside of that, Regardless of Johanna, some other things continue to be the same for the Lannister family. I believe Tywin would still have a falling out with the crown, Jaime will be named to the Kingsguard like canon, and Tywin will resign from his post in outrage now that Tyrion is his heir. Though he won't openly express the displeasure of his younger son in front of his wife, because she'd probably let him have it. So for the time being, up until the rebellion, pretty much everything stays the same. I can't imagine that Johanna being alive at this point would lead to changes that are drastic in this part of history. However, during this time between the tourney of Harrenhal, where Jaime was made into a Kingsguard, and the time of Robert's rebellion, I believe that with the survival of his wife, there is a chance that Tywin ends up having more children with his wife Johanna. This makes a lot of sense, since in canon, Tywin never remarried after his wife's death, and he wasn't too old to have kids yet. Realistically, we could have had more Lannister siblings had Tywin not chosen to abstain from remarriage, but now with the love of his life still alive, that becomes more than just a possibility. During these years before the realm descends into chaos, Johanna will get pregnant and deliver another child by her husband, who doesn't have dwarfism like Tyrion. This child will be known as Jason Lannister, now the youngest of the Lannister siblings, making Tyrion the middle child. This sets up a conflict for the future, if you ask me, because Tywin doesn't want Tyrion to be his heir, and if he can't get Jaime back, he may decide to pin his hopes on the youngest of his children, depending on what qualities he exhibits as he gets older, of course. But I do believe it's safe to say that as Jason grows, Tywin would put more effort into their relationship than he does with Tyrion, but the consequences of that won't appear for a while. For now, we stick with the rebellion, and how there are no real heavy changes, like Jaime joining the Kingsguard or Tywin's position as hand of the king to Aerys. I think that this conflict pretty much goes and ends the same as it did in canon, with the Targaryens losing, Tywin sacking King's Landing and killing the family of Rhaegar, Jaime killing Aerys, and Robert Baratheon taking the throne. I will say that before he sacks the city and kills the family of Rhaegar, Tywin may hesitate for a moment. He'll think of his wife Johanna and what she may think of him when all is said and done. She might judge him for it, but at the end of the day, things need to be done, no matter how dirty they may be. So regardless of what she'll think or make of him, he goes through with his cruel act. And the story pretty much continues the same for the most part, with Robert as king, Tywin offering up Cersei as his queen, and so on and so forth. Now with this development, with Cersei becoming the queen and Jaime being on the Kingsguard, I believe that this would cause some concern for Lady Johanna when it comes to her children being in close proximity again. Given their youthful experiments, she'll wonder if they'll fall back into old habits. It'll be something that plagues her mind up until the wedding between Robert and Cersei, but despite the concern, I once again don't think that she'll tell anyone anything. And the main reason that is because of how much time has passed between her children. For years, Jaime and Cersei have been separated. Cersei would have been at court with Tywin, and Jaime would have been off being a squire and becoming a knight. Then Jaime went to the Kingsguard, and Cersei was taken back to Casterly Rock. And while there were brief moments where they did get to interact with each other, it's been years. So who knows if they'll still have that connection like they did when they were kids, when it comes to the incest. At this point, she hasn't heard anything from anyone about it or seen anything from her kids. I could easily see Johanna putting her head in the sand when it comes to her children. Maybe after all these years, she excuses that one incident as childish curiosity, and that maybe now her two oldest kids would have grown out of it. Plus, at this point, the match between Cersei and Robert has already been made. And I think that like Tywin, she wouldn't want to slander her family image by exposing her kids as possibly incestuous. Especially when she has no real evidence but her spoken word. So the issue is left alone for the time being, and time passes relatively normally like it did in canon. However, there is one point of interest with the Lannisters that I see changing pretty heavily that deals with Tyrion and his very first marriage. Marriage is a cornerstone of Westeros. It is the foundation of power and political alliances, but even with that being said, it's not uncommon for people to marry for love. Once upon a time, at the age of 13, Tyrion fell in love with a common woman named Tysha after she was attacked by outlaws. They fell for each other pretty fast, and got married in secret with a jump septon to help them out. Eventually, Tywin found out about this marriage, and he made it his mission to ruin it. He told Tyrion that Tysha wasn't actually in love with him, that she was just paid by Jaime to make a man out of Tyrion, that her being chased and saved was all fake, orchestrated. Tywin then allowed his guards to assault Tysha in front of Tyrion, then made him do the very same to her, and pay her for it. Tyrion spent his entire life believing that no one could ever love him as a result of this, and that Tysha was nothing more than a prostitute. It really messed up his perception of what love was. But in the books, this is revealed to be a lie by Jaime once he frees him after his trial by combat, where Oberyn is killed by the Mountain. Tywin had lied all these years. Tysha wasn't paid to fool Tyrion. She was really just a normal girl who fell in love with him, and the whole thing was an elaborate ruse by Tywin to make Tyrion feel that no one could ever love him. This set Tyrion on a really dark path in the books once he found out. But here, it would be different. Tyrion would still meet Tysha in this timeline, and I would even venture to say that the two of them still get married. But unlike canon, Tywin won't traumatize Tyrion for it. The reason for this is, once again, because of his wife Johanna. Tywin hated Tyrion in the original timeline, because his wife died. So he went out of his way to make Tyrion's life miserable. Here, his wife is alive, so he doesn't hate Tyrion for killing the woman that he loves. At most, he tolerates Tyrion on the account of his wife, so there's less need to go that far to teach Tyrion such a cruel and unnecessary lesson. In addition, once Tywin finds out, I do actually think that he would want to annul the marriage, since Tyrion is still a Lannister, and a common woman is unfit for the family name. But depending on her character, I believe that Johanna would be able to convince Tywin to let Tyrion stay married to her. She would cite that it's not strange for people to marry for love. It's something that they did. And not to mention, Tywin has tried and failed multiple times to marry Tyrion off to highborn women from the moment he was born. So if this girl is interested in Tyrion, why not let them be together? He needs a wife and a way to sire heirs anyway, as the heir to Tywin himself. I believe he wouldn't really put much of a fight against Johanna when it comes to Tyrion, because at the end of the day, he cares less about him than he does Cersei and Jaime, which is why he didn't let them marry the Martells. Tywin also still sees Jaime as his true heir, and even with him in the Kingsguard, Tywin still has other options outside of Tyrion when it comes to inheritance, with his youngest son, Jason. If he lets Tyrion marry a commoner, it may suck somewhat for his reputation, but he can always pivot and try to replace Tyrion as his heir with his youngest son at some point. So there's no real need to go above and beyond to break this marriage pact. It's not like Tyrion's getting any marriage offers for himself anytime soon, and he's not trying to traumatize his son in this timeline either, so Tyrion and Tysha are allowed to wed each other unburdened, which will set the stage for a much happier life for Tyrion in the long run. Meanwhile, as the years go by, Tywin refocuses his efforts on his youngest son, Jason. Jason would be a very interesting character to follow, as due to his birth a little before the rebellion, it puts him in the same generation as people like Robb Stark, Marjorie Tyrell, Joffrey Baratheon, and so on. By the time the main series starts, he'd be a teenager, and under the tutelage of his father, Tywin, unknowingly being prepared to be heir over his brother, Tyrion. I imagine Jason is another one of the decent Lannisters. He has a somewhat positive relationship with his mother and his siblings, but he would grow up with a chip on his shoulder, which comes from being raised in the shadow of his brother, Jaime. Jason Lannister would be a talented fighter, eager to please his father, but it would become very clear that Tywin values his brother Jaime the most out of all of his children, and Jason just doesn't compare to his oldest brother. I see him being like Loras Tyrell in some ways, once again kind of referring to his book counterpart in this instance. In the books, Loras Tyrell has older brothers, not just a sister through Marjorie. Loras is seen as a talented fighter, but he has an older brother named Garland who is way better than he is. Loras even admits this in the books. It would be similar for Jason where he's good, but Jaime is better. And like Tyrion, despite being favored a bit more than him, he is subject to comparison with the Kingslayer, which could lead to a level of jealousy as most of Tywin's children just want their father's approval. But that's where I'm going to end this video for today. If Lady Johanna survived childbirth, this would have led to an arguably much happier Lannister family. Tywin has another son, Tyrion grows up less traumatized and gets to marry the woman he loves, and heck, by the time the main story starts, he may even have children of his own with Tysha. It might deal a blow to his ego though if they end up coming out taller than him. But that's all for now. I hope you guys enjoyed it. Don't forget to like, subscribe, tell me your thoughts down below, along with what changes you might have made to the story, and I will see you all next time.